Go.
Hello, I'm Vander Elst. I'm a freelance writer and lecturer living in Oxfordshire, and I'm the number 4 candidate on the UK Independence Party list for the South East region in these coming European elections. The buildings you see behind me belong to the Oxford Union, the world's oldest and most famous debating society, in which I once served as an officer in the early 1970s. As a cradle of free speech and a nursery of parliamentary debate for generations of British politicians, I think the Oxford Union is an appropriate backdrop for my comments about why I'm fighting in this election to take Britain out of the European Union. As the President of the European Parliament recently acknowledged, 3/4 of all the laws now coming before our Westminster Parliament to be rubber-stamped each year originate in EU institutions in which British representatives only control about 8% of the total votes. This rule from Brussels has never been approved by any democratic vote of the British people. The victory of the Yes campaign in the 1975 European referendum, which was the only referendum we've ever had on the European issue in this country, was based on a fraudulent assurance by the British political establishment that membership of the European Union was only about jobs and trade and not about political union. That was a lie, and we've been paying a heavy political and economic price for that lie ever since. We now find ourselves in a situation where we are increasingly absorbed by a European superstate whose centralized decision-making affects nearly everything in our lives, from post office closures to home information packs. In return for this, we're paying through the nose economically. EU trade barriers against the outside world and its costly and protectionist common agricultural policy put up the price of our food and of our raw materials. EU regulations have cost Britain over £106 billion over the last 10 years alone, destroying thousands of British jobs and businesses and hindering the growth of the remainder. In fact, if you add up all the economic costs to Britain of our membership of the European Union, the cost of the common agricultural policy, the cost of the common fisheries policy, which has almost destroyed our fishing industry, the cost of EU regulations and of Britain's net annual contribution to the European budget, and various other payments to EU projects and institutions, our membership of the European Union costs Britain an annual sum of over £55 billion. That is equivalent to £1,799 per year per taxpayer, or £915 for every man, woman and child per year in this country. Not only then are we paying through the nose for our membership of the European Union, but much of the money we surrender to Brussels is corruptly spent. 2008 was the 14th year running that the European Court of Auditors refused to approve the accounts of the European Union because of concerns about areas of spending amounting to 80% of the EU budget. You might think, against this background, that the EU political and bureaucratic elite would feel chastened and anxious to reassure European voters of their commitment to restoring financial probity and democratic accountability to the European project. Not a bit of it. Commenting, for example, on recent press reports that she will receive 9 million Danish kroner, or £1,124,000 in pension payments on her retirement, EU Agriculture Commissioner Marianne Fisher-Boel declared, "I think I'm worth all the millions." As for democracy, consider the shabby story of the power-centralizing European Constitution of 2003. Decisively rejected by the French and Dutch electorates in their 2005 referendums, the EU political elite simply repackaged this constitution in the form of the current Lisbon Treaty with only minor cosmetic changes, and this Lisbon Treaty has been rammed through the French and Dutch parliaments and other national parliaments, including our own, without any further consultation of the people. The essentially anti-democratic spirit behind the European project was perfectly captured a few years ago by Raymond Barre, a former French Prime Minister and European Commissioner. "I have never understood," he said, why public opinion about European ideas should be taken into account. So much for democracy within the European Union. As someone whose grandparents were members of the Belgian resistance during World War II, and as someone who has lived much of his life in French-speaking countries, like my fellow UKIP candidates in the southeast, my opposition to the European Union is not based on any hostility to foreigners or any spirit of Little Englandism. We believe in an outward-looking internationalism based on free trade and friendly cooperation between independent sovereign nations. After a 20th century in which 170 million people were killed in internal repression by tyrannical governments, according to a recent study, our model of international cooperation based on free trade and cooperation between independent states is a more liberal and safer model of international cooperation than the centralization of power involved in the creation of a European superstate. More than 3/4 of our overseas assets and more than half Britain's external trade is with countries outside the European Union. In addition, we enjoy, or perhaps the better word is suffer, a persistent trade deficit with the European Union, which means that our EU partners are more dependent on their trade with us than we are on our trade with them. There is therefore no economic reason why Britain should not leave the European Union and replace the current membership of it with a free trade agreement and an intergovernmental cooperation between independent sovereign states. A recent BBC poll showed that 55% of the British electorate want Britain to leave the European Union and simply maintain close trading links with it. UKIP is the only mainstream political party advocating this policy. The official Tory line, by contrast, of renegotiating and improving our terms of membership of the European Union is a complete non-starter, because any major revision of the European treaties requires the unanimous agreement of all 27 member states, which will never be forthcoming for that purpose. I believe that it's time for this country to leave the European Union. If you share my view that it's time to go, then vote for UKIP, the only party putting forward this policy, and take this opportunity of giving the corrupt EU elite and the British political establishment the biggest kick up the backside they've ever known. Thank you.